In the meantime, I'd like us to proceed to Title III. I understand that there are some members who have extensive questions they want to ask council and issues they want to discuss in Title III. I know that Mr. Barton was particularly interested in doing this, but I would like to now recognize any member who wishes to go to Title III. Mr. Barton is here. Good. Mr. Barton has done a good job, because you don't have much left on that plate. It's okay.
I know we have to go to the White House. What's the situation? Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Barton to ask questions of council in Title III, if you're ready to do that.
I'm ready to do it.
Okay.
I am ready to do it. Let me get my...
Gentleman will be recognized. I know he has an extensive question, so let me I'll recognize your 5 minutes, and if you want more time, we'll give you even more time.
Mr. Chairman, I can ask questions for probably the next hour, if that's the will of the committee, or I can ask questions for such time as you wish me to. I do.
Well, let's start off with a 5-minute increment. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, my first question is on page 379. In line 5, it says, the quantity of the United States greenhouse gas emissions does not exceed 80%.
Would you, excuse me, just for the members' information, we are not going to have any votes before 8:30 when the members come back from the White House. Then we'll proceed to the last debate on the pending amendment by Mr. Terry, and then go on to other amendments that may be ready to be considered at that time. So just so members know what the situation is. Further, to inform the members, we have provided dinner on both sides of the aisle again, and for this evening, I've been informed have selected Lebanese food. Some people call it Lebanese food. Some people call it Turkish food. Some people call it Israeli food. Some people call it Greek food. It's the food of the Mediterranean. And if only the people in the Middle East could understand they share many things, including their food, then cultures, they ought to learn to live in peace, just like this committee is going to be able to do at some point. At some point. Okay. I recognize I'm going to give the gentleman his full 5 minutes. Thank you for allowing me to make that announcement.
On page 379, line 5, the quantity, the goal for greenhouse gas emission reduction in 2020 is not to exceed 80% of the emissions target in 2005. But in the very next page, or several, on page 380, line 1, the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions from capped sources does not exceed 83%. You've got a 3% discrepancy. Why is that?
Section 702, which has the 80% on page 379, is an overall goal that applies to the quantity of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Section 703 applies only to the greenhouse gas emissions of capped sources.
Then why on page 379 are the percentages for 2012, which is 97%, and 2030, which is 58%, and 2050, which is 17%, why are they identical in section 703, and the only difference between 703 and 702 is in 2020?
That's because the bill is written so that the targets and the goals are identical for 3 of the 4 years that are specified, but for 2020 they are different.
Is council aware of the policy reason for that?
The statute says that they are the same for 3 of the 4 years and that they are different for the 2020 target.
Would Mr. Markey care to comment on that?
Could the gentleman restate
Well,
his inquiry?
There has been much gnashing of teeth on your side on Section 703. Mr. Boucher, among others, labored long and hard to get the amount of capped sources down to 17% instead of 20%. But the goal didn't change for 2020. The goals don't change for any of the other targeted years except that year. I'm curious as to why there's a difference on that one targeted year between the goals and the capped emission sources.
If the gentleman would yield, the 20% is an aspirational goal. The 17% is the goal set for regulatory purposes in terms of what reductions in greenhouse gases would be achieved.
Well, why the difference in aspirational goals? In that, that's the only year there's a difference between aspiration and requirement.
Yeah, it's a goal that's established so that the economy as a whole can try to do better, but in terms of the regulatory benchmarks that are established in the legislation, the 17% number is the operative number.
Okay. Well, let's go to Section 704, supplemental pollution reductions. First of all, what is a supplemental pollution reduction?
I don't believe that term is defined in the statute.
We just have it hanging out, begging for definition.
The statute provides that a specified number of allowances will be used to get the supplemental pollution reductions, and then on page 381 it says that shall provide greenhouse gas reductions in an amount equal to an additional 10 percentage point of reductions from U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in 2005.
Okay. What does this mean? Activities supported under Part E shall provide greenhouse gas reductions in an amount equal to an additional 10 percentage points of reductions from the United States greenhouse gas emissions in 2005.
Yes, sir, it cross-references Part E, and if you look on page 515, it does define supplemental emission reductions there to mean greenhouse gas emission reductions achieved from reduced or avoided deforestation under this part.
Well, I can read, but I don't understand the, again, this may be a question to the one of the authors. What's the intent of this? Are we trying to get an additional 10% CO2 or greenhouse gas reductions in addition to the capped target on page 420 for that particular year?
Below 2005 levels by 2020 by using 5% of emission.
Yeah, the goal, if you are you back in the supplemental pollution reductions
yes,
section?
Sir.
Yes. Since 20% of all greenhouse gases internationally are released because of deforestation. This section is intended to create the incentives for a huge a percentage of gains to be reached by preventing deforestation in a very cost-effective way that, in fact, reduces the need to reach other parts of our economy to ask in the near term for reductions to come
But
from
my-
our economic engine. So,
My
so this
question-
program is intended to create the incentives for that to be occurred.
You want an additional 10 percentage points in CO2 reductions from the United States. I don't see how you're going to do that.
It is equal to an additional 10 percentage points.
Right.
It's in an amount equal to.
Equal to.
Okay. So that's going to happen overseas.
That is correct.
You hope it does.
We hope it does, and we will ensure that there is a monitoring program put in place that reflects the importance of ensuring that the program does work.
Okay. Let's go to Section 705.
And I say that the gentleman's
Oh,
time
I'm
has
sorry.
expired.
It has.
He is at 8.
I admit it has.
He is at 8 minutes right now, and
I'm just getting started, though, Mr.
no. Oh, I know that. I know that. But I think that we should go to the other side briefly and see if there are any members on the majority side that would seek recognition at this time. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it appropriate to offer an amendment now, since you've come over to this side on Title III?
May I be recognized, Mr. Chairman?
I'd be happy to yield to
If
Mr.
the
Barton.
gentlelady would like to yield to the gentleman from Texas.
It
yes.
was my understanding that this time was going to be used asking questions on Title III, and that we wouldn't go to amendments.
I think that the agreement that Mr. Waxman reached and announced was that amendments could be considered during this period of time, but there would be no roll calls,
I didn't agree to that.
no recorded votes until.
I did not agree to that.
All right, then let us.
So, reclaiming my time, if there isn't anyone on our side that has questions, then what are we going to do until 8:30? Have Mr. Barton keep asking questions?
We're going to take a brief. We're going to suspend here for 2 minutes.
Good idea. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
To just let Barton continue asking questions, which I actually thought was what they had agreed to, but. Markey. And you should just let Barton go.
We will. The committee will recommence, and I want to continue to recognize the gentlelady from California and ask if she has any additional points which she would like to make.
Other than my amendment, I don't.
No, it would, I thank the gentlelady. We have an agreement
Okay.
that we have reached that will allow any member who wishes to ask questions with regard to the contents of the legislation to do so. And then we will proceed to an amendment made by the minority, which, in the opinion of the minority, will last some time because of the importance of that amendment, which would then take us up to the period of time that is 8:30, that we expect the members who have been invited to the White House for dinner to return. And at that point, the debate could continue, but yet with the members here, that would allow us to have a roll call that they could participate in. So we won't be rolling any, we will not be rolling any additional roll calls. We will only be having a vote on that one roll call that we all agreed that we would vote on, but any subsequent amendments which we debate will be voted upon without having been rolled.
So only questions, Mr. Chairman, about the entire bill?
Questions?
And no amendments being offered with votes held?
No, there could be an amendment which is offered, but it will be an amendment which the minority, in its opinion, will be a majority amendment, but it will be a minority amendment, I think, that will spur such significant interest that it would clearly not be completed. That is the debate portion of that amendment until after 8:30. I thank the gentlelady. There are other members seeking recognition for discussion about the legislation pending before us. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's go back to section 705, excuse me, Mr. Chairman. This is a requirement that the administrator do a series of analysis and issue reports. And paragraph 3 of subsection A requires an analysis of the status of worldwide greenhouse gas reductions efforts, including the implementation of this act and other acts. But then in the very next paragraph B, it says, except that paragraph 3 of subsection A shall not apply. Now, my question is, why do you require
Joel?
in the paragraph above that we do this analysis and have this report, and in the very next section you say, but you really don't have to do it? That makes no sense to me.
No, don't solve any of it.
It's required in subsequent reports. The statute provides that it is, paragraph 3 only does not apply to the first report.
But my question is, why?
Why is there an exception here?
Why require a report,
Report comes
but then not require it the first time?
Status of worldwide greenhouse gas reduction. The first report comes out in 2013, including implementation of the Safe Climate Act, which starts in 2012. So
Okay, good.
this is a quadrennial report, so to have the first one do it in 2013, which is 1 year after that.
Yes, this program starts in 2012. There are quadrennial reports under this section which are required, and that is why that first report is not required. That is, as you refer back to subsection B, the exception, because a study could not be completed by 2013 since the program starts in 2012, and the section calls for a report to be completed.
But it says an analysis of the status of worldwide greenhouse gas reduction efforts, including implementation. I mean, it's a minor point. It's seems ludicrous to require a report and then not require it, but I didn't write the bill. So let's go on to the next page, on page 383, where we're talking about trying to get the latest scientific information, which I think is a good thing. I will point out that you have to do it. This is a report that the United States EPA is going to prepare, and it's by country. So it's a worldwide report, including the annual total of CO2, the annual per capita, the cumulative anthropogenic emissions for the top 50 emitting nations. That's no small feat. And then in paragraph B on line 11, uses the term, has to report on significant changes, both globally and region, in annual net non-anthropogenic, which means made by God, greenhouse gas emissions from natural sources. My question on 11 page on line 11 is, what is significant? What's the definition of what constitutes a significant change globally in region in annual net non-anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions? That's a fairly significant requirement.
Significant on this, for this paragraph, is not defined in the statute. It would be left to the administrator to determine as part of the analysis.
Does my esteemed friend from Massachusetts care to comment? I mean, that is a fairly large requirement to comment on, and it's undefined.
Well, I think the EPA administrator, in her or his discretion, will be able to make that determination.
It's going to be their call.
Yes.
All right. Let's move over to page 386. This is, again, a reporting requirement. In assessing risk and impacts, use a risk management framework including both qualitative and quantitative measures to assess the observed and projected impacts of current and future climate change, accounting for both monetized and non-monetized losses. What is a non-monetized loss?
A loss that has not been converted into dollar terms.
That's not an answer. What's an example of a non-monetized loss?
Species extinction.
So it would be a species lost. It could be a vast ecological loss that is related to greenhouse gas emissions or other impacts.
All right.
Would the gentleman yield just for a second? Down here, Ranking Member Barton. This brings up a great debate on, when I read through the draft, the initial draft, and everywhere in this provision, there's quite a few places where we talk about the damaging effects of global warming. But this, in the draft, now I haven't read the manager's amendment, but there's nowhere that I remember reading of listing or having the EPA director list and account for any of the positive effects of global warming. Would the chairman, can the chairman count, if there are positive effects of global warming, should they not also be accounted for by the Environmental Protection Agency?
Under the language on page 386, lines 10 to 14, it says, in assessing risks and impacts, use a risk management framework including both qualitative and quantitative measures to assess the observed and projected impacts of current and future climate change. So those impacts, of course, will lead. If what the gentleman is saying is in certain areas perhaps there is a warming climate, then those impacts could be noted if there were.
So the positive impacts of global warming will be addressed by the administrator in this process.
Impacts. Yeah.
I mean, negative impacts and positive impacts.
Well, I suppose.
I mean,
under that, using that definition, I don't think we're going to put in negative and positive, but yes, impacts, and under that would be all impacts.
So I appreciate that. Thank you, Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. I could ask you a question about nonlinear, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go to page 387, and this one is a little more important. On line 6, describe the increased risk to natural systems and society that would result from an increase in global average temperatures of 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 2 degrees Celsius, above the pre-industrial average, or an increase in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations above 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. My first question is, why those numbers? Why 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit and 450 million parts per million of CO2 equivalent? And then my second question is, what is the pre-industrial average?
Those are the numbers that were identified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the United Nations as triggering points for more severe consequences as a result of a warming planet.
Well, what is the pre-industrial average that's referred to?
The pre-industrial average is 280 parts per million. It has now increased to a range of 360 to 380 parts per million. So essentially what they're referring to is...
The pre-industrial average of temperature. I'll stipulate that you're right on your CO2 number. That's good. You've been doing your homework.
Thank you.
The number I had was 250 in 1850, and the number I have today is 380. Mm-hmm. So we're in the ballpark on that. Mm-hmm. But this 3.6 degree Fahrenheit number, I'm not familiar with, and I honestly don't know what the pre-industrial temperature average that they refer to is.
Well,
it's fairly important.
I think what you would do is you would just let's just do some subtraction here. Then it would be once it goes 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial average. Now, off the top of my head, I don't know what that number is. I do know, however, that the National Academies of Science represented from all the countries of the world in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have come to that conclusion. And so it is a number which is the consensus number of the scientists of the world who won the Nobel Prize on this subject 2 years ago. And I think it's a good number, and I'm not willing to second guess it. I think it's a number we should be working.
I think it's a number the American people deserve to know, and let me tell you why I think that. My information is that since 1850, I don't know what the pre-industrial average for temperature is. I don't know, but I am led to believe that the average temperature in the United States since 1850 has gone up about 1 degree Fahrenheit. 1 degree. And I am told by scientists that are much smarter than I am that if we implement fully this 83% reduction in CO2 by the year 2050, which is the target in the bill, and it is has the amount of carbon or carbon equivalent, CO2 equivalent, over on page 421 of this bill, that the measurable temperature change is going to be less than 1/10 of 1 degree Fahrenheit. Now, this is a political question more than a question of the Council. Why in the world we put the U.S. economy through an economic ringer like we're probably going to do if this bill were to become law, when the temperature between 1850 and today has gone up about 1 degree Fahrenheit, and regardless, even if we meet these targets for CO2 reduction, the measurable temperature change between now and 2050 is about 1/10 of 1 degree Fahrenheit. So this, on page 387, this 3.6 degree Fahrenheit and this pre-industrial average are non-trivial inflection points. I don't dispute what the chairman just said, that 3.6 degree number is mentioned in the IPCC. You're right about that. But I don't know what the pre-industrial number is, and if I'm right that the temperature increase in the last 150 or 160 years is about 1 degree, in the next 40 years, it's, even if you go to these great reductions that you're talking about in your bill, you get at most 1/10 of 1 degree in Fahrenheit temperature change to the negative. Is that worth the pain and suffering we're going to put the U.S. economy through?
Well,
and that's a political question.
Okay, and I appreciate that, and I thank the gentleman for asking the question. We're working off of the best science that can be provided, and that is the collective judgment of the scientists of every country in the world, which came to a consensus in a series of 4 reports, which they issued back in 2007, which has become the undisputed working, well, I can't say undisputed. There are some that still dispute these numbers. However, the numbers, for the most part, are those adopted now by every country in the world in terms of what does constitute an increased level of CO2 emitted to the atmosphere in terms of an association with dangerous climate change. So that is the working premise that we are using. That is the premise which the European community is using, and that is the premise that we are going to ask the Chinese and Indians to use as well. In fact, the head of this group, the IPCC, Dr. Pachuri, was an Indian. And so this is a consensus that not only American scientists, but Indian and Chinese and other scientists accepted. In fact, however, there have been scientific reports since then that indicate that there has been an even more rapid increase in the danger to the planet. But for the purposes of what we are discussing right now, we're using the IPCC numbers. And we believe that that's the best scientific information available. So our bill is science-based, it's technology-driven, it's market-oriented, and it's consumer-focused. But ultimately, it's science-driven. Okay? We are relying upon the science as it has been developed by the best people in the world. Now, the gentleman, again, is at 11 minutes right now, and I will come right back to him if you don't mind, after I seek recognition of any member to be recognized for any purpose. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
I think Mr. Barton raises an interesting point I thought it was worth responding to. One of the things that people argue is that if the United States reduces its carbon emissions by 80%, it's meaningless because essentially the world could continue to warm regardless. And I don't agree with the numbers that Mr. Barton has thrown out of the relatively de minimis change, because I've seen estimates that are much higher as far as how much we would vary the temperature just by United States action. But I want to note that all of us, I think Democrats and Republicans alike, agree that if we achieve this 80% reduction, it is not going to save the planet alone. It's going to require the rest of the world becoming engaged in this effort. Now, the number that Mr. Barton threw out is if the United States achieves an 80% reduction, it might have a relatively modest result, at least as a number. But if it allows the rest of the world to move forward, encourages, inspires, and in some sense requires the rest of the world to move forward, we can, in fact, and the IPCC report makes clear, stabilize the Earth's temperature at about 2 degrees increase above the the situation we have today. Now, this is the consensus product of the world's scientific community. They have said in rather confident terms, if we reduce global CO2 emissions by 50 to 60%, we can stabilize the climate. If we do not, we have the potential of runaway global warming. And I want to refer you to an MIT study that was just published yesterday and this is why this is a very timely debate. And I'm just looking for the name of the publication. It was in Science Daily, published yesterday. And the title was Climate Change Odds Much Worse Than Thought. This was an MIT study using a new sophisticated computer analysis that basically has concluded that the median probability of surface warming is 5.2 degrees Celsius by 2100 in the business as usual case, with a 90% probability range of 3.5 to 7.4 degrees. That's compared to a median projected increase in 2003 of 2.4 degrees. The point I want to make is that the science is now rapidly leading to the conclusion that this problem is greater and faster than we thought just a few years ago, and that this is a consensus of world scientific opinion. So I guess the fundamental point I would make is even if we conclude that American reductions will not save the planet singularly, we know it is imperative to get the world to act jointly so in fact we can save the planet. And for those who argue that we should not take this action, it's kind of like when you try to get your kids not to throw their junk out the window of the car. And they say, well, gee, Dad, somebody else will just throw stuff out the car, and if I refrain from throwing my junk out the car, it will only reduce the total impact of refuge by 0.15%. We still don't throw the stuff out the car window. And I know that sounds maybe simplistic as an analogy globally, but I think it is a real one. So I would suggest we're on the right track here, and hope we succeed.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Yeah, I have a couple questions for the council. I think the chairman. On page 381, I have a question for the council regarding the administrator's review of the program in the bill. As you know, China and other developing nations refuse to provide emissions data to the UN with the same frequency and accuracy as the U.S., and the date of emissions for China's most recent UN submission, I'm told, is for the year 1995, 14 years ago. So I notice here that the administrator shall, in consultation with appropriate federal agencies, submit to Congress a report not later than July 1st, 2013, and every 4 years thereafter. Are there any provisions in this substitute or in this bill regarding enforcement or data from international emissions that would be of the same type of quality? Is there any reference that I may look at or not? In other words, we're required to submit this information or make it public to the Congress. Is there a similar standard for China, for India, for other nations within this bill? Is there something that we can compare apples to apples with?
Sir, are you asking if there is a requirement in the
Yeah,
fact
is there
that
something in
China
this? Yeah, is there
submit data
something
to
that,
the United
that we're aware of?
States?
And maybe I can relay that to the chairman, Mr. Markey. I don't know if there's some international data that we can compare this to. Just know, as I said, that the last emission data we had was 1994. I don't know if it's been updated. I don't know what requirement that there is, whether the
I thank the gentleman.
Yes,
I thank the
yield to
gentleman.
the gentleman.
As a matter of American domestic policy, we cannot mandate that the Indians or Chinese do anything. However, if you turn to page 381,
That's where I'm at.
line 19, there is a requirement that the administrator of the EPA conduct, and that now move down to line 19, an analysis of capabilities to monitor and verify greenhouse gas reductions on a worldwide basis, including for the United States as required under the Safe Climate Act. So
we're going to do this for them?
Well, again, there is a cumulative impact of CO2 on the planet as a whole. So it is in our interest to try as best we can to identify where the sources of greenhouse gases on the planet are emanating from.
Has anyone talked to the Chinese to see if they'll be cooperative?
The point of, if the gentleman would yield, the point of our moving forward is that the President can have a meaningful negotiation with the Chinese, Indians, and others in Copenhagen this December. That is why we have constructed this legislation with long transition protections for our trade sensitive industries, so that there cannot be a action taken by China or other nations in the near term, so that there can be a regulatory scheme put in place on a global or at least sectoral basis, depending upon the industry, that does lead to monitored greenhouse gas emissions and reductions from those sectors.
Well, later on, I intend to offer an amendment that would require all of this to be WTO compliant, and maybe that stick will help the Chinese, if that amendment is adopted, to comply. And maybe I could make it a bipartisan amendment.
Well, again, if the gentleman should understand that our legislation does, in fact, give the President the authority to put in place tariffs. Ultimately, that construct will be made by the Ways and Means Committee in the event that there is noncompliance by the Chinese or other countries.
I might ask the Council whether there is some place in this bill that offsets from China are allowed under the bill.
There is an international offset.
Just a minute.
Any country, if the gentleman would deal, any country which is a signatory to the treaty, and that is compliant with the standards established for offsets would qualify.
Okay. My time has expired. I yield back.
Let me just note the gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since we have, this is an unusual amount of time that we have just to ask some questions, pose some questions. I don't have questions of the council. I have a question of the ranking member of the committee.
Could we welcome our former colleague and
Yes.
senator from Ohio, Mr. Brown?
Isn't that nice?
He's sitting
Right
down
here,
there by Jay Ensign.
making noise in front of me. But welcome.
He is having a chuckle.
He is. And it's great to see him back here. In listening to the debate, and certainly the ranking member is the leader of it, for the most part, obviously
wish I were
opposed to
winning the
the
debate.
to the legislation. I just have one question that I'd like to ask you.
All right?
Do you believe in the accumulated science that there is indeed global warming?
I accept that CO2 concentrations have gone up since 1850. I accept the scientific consensus that about where they are now. I accept the probability that in the next 100 years they're going to go up into the neighborhood of 500 parts per million. I accept that. I do not accept that it's been proven that CO2 drives temperature. I think it is just as possible that temperature drives CO2. That was the prevailing theory until about 25 years ago, that CO2 was a dependent variable and that it rose as a result of temperature increases. That's what the ice ring data and all that appears to show. I do accept that there has been some warming, but the models that predict the catastrophic warming are not proving very reliable in predicting what's happening on an annual basis. The average world temperature has gone down the last 7 years in a row. It has not gone up. And so I think it is unwise to adopt a radical regime like is imposed in this bill that will have significant cost to our economy without any significant verifiable change in what appears to be the emerging temperature patterns. I mean, there are a large number of scientists, not just a few, but a large number of scientists that would come before this committee and testify under oath that the temperature gradient differential 50 to 100 years from now is not going to be measurably different if we adopt and implement successfully these radical CO2 and other greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate the gentleman's response, and I think anyone listening is, struck with your sincerity. And I do believe that you are sincere.
I am.
You are sincere in your belief that what so many on this side believes is one of the great challenges of the 21st century, that your sincerely held beliefs are different than the body of science that has instructed us and why we're embarking on this bill. Now, I mean, this obviously was not a trick question, but I think that since I would have never brought it up unless we had this time while we're waiting for members to come back. But I really wanted this to be part of the record because you most sincerely see this the way you do. And
well, it's not.
I respect that. I respect that.
It's not just me.
I don't agree, but
I know it's not just me, though. I mean, there are a large number of very well-informed scientific climatologists that agree with what I have stipulated. So it's not just a personally held belief.
yeah, well, I thank the gentleman. I mean, you've always been my friend. We've done other bills together. It doesn't look like we're doing this one together, but did you want me to yield time to you?
Yeah, would the gentlelady yield?
I'd be glad to. Thank you, Mr. Barton.
I thank the gentlelady. And again, that's the essence of the debate. And I think this is not a bad period of time to have. Maybe this is like the halftime analysis, update of where we are right now. We believe on our side that the science is sound. that, that the planet is running a fever, that there are no emergency rooms for planets, that we have to act in a preventative way in order to ensure that we avoid the worst consequences of climate change. We also, on our side, believe that there will not be a severe economic impact that our country suffers from if we act. In fact, we believe just the opposite. We believe that we can unleash a green jobs revolution in our country, and that it will provide a brand new manufacturing sector for us. So there are big differences in how we view the science and the opportunity. All right, and that's what this debate is going to be all about for the rest of this evening and all day tomorrow and into the night. The gentlelady's time has expired. Are there any members on the minority side that would seek recognition? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. I know you looked everywhere. I want to go to page 397, and this is where they have to designate greenhouse gases for control purposes. I would point out for the record that it's not just CO2, it's also methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur, hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, any perfluorocarbon, nitrogen trifluoride, and on the top of page 397, any other anthropogenic gas designated as a greenhouse gas by the administrator. My question on line 6, it talks about in determining whether the administrator designates this as a greenhouse gas, it says determine whether 1 metric ton of another anthropogenic gas makes the same or greater contribution to global warming over 100 years as 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. My question to council is, what is the contribution to global warming over 100 years of 1 metric ton of CO2? I think it's 0. What does 1 metric ton of CO2 over 100 years make to global warming? That's the standard in the Act to designate a man-made gas as a greenhouse gas and subject to regulation. It would seem to be that we would know the answer to that question. That's not.
Would council answer that question?
I doubt that she would have the answer to that.
The statute provides that everything is compared to CO2, and there are later on in the bill, in section 712, we give the comparisons for other
I understand
gases
that,
to carbon
but
dioxide.
nowhere in the, and I've read it, there's nowhere in this Act does it say what that standard is. Now, again, let's put some math on the table. The United States generates about 7.2 billion metric tons of CO2 man-made a year. 7.2. All the from natural occurrences, we get about 15 billion. So the total creation of CO2 in the United States on an annual basis is approaching 20 billion metric tons. 20 billion metric tons. 1 metric ton of CO2 over 100 years is 100 metric tons. In the overall scheme of things, that is not a lot of CO2. That has got to be a... So if there is a metric that says how much that contributes to global warming, I've never seen it. And everything in this Act is based on that metric. So we should be able to call down to EPA. I don't expect the council to know that. She's not a climatologist. I don't expect Chairman Waxman or Chairman Markey.
No, I know it.
Do you know it?
I know it, yeah.
Well, okay. What is it?
What's the question?
All right. What is the contribution to global warming over 100 years of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide? Everything in this act is based on that standard.
May I ask the council, is that true? Is everything in the act based on that standard?
Your regulatory regime is.
The annual tonnage limit and the allowances are based on the comparing other gases to the amount of global warming that's caused by
that's
1
right.
ton, 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. And that the statute does on page 405 reference the global warming potentials that are given in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fourth Assessment
And I
Report.
accept those. I've reviewed them. I don't have, they're scientifically correct. I'm not questioning that. But I am questioning this because it's never appeared in print.
What is your question?
Is the act gives the director of the EPA, the administrator of the EPA, or any other citizen, any person may petition the administrator to designate as a greenhouse gas any anthropogenic gas 1 metric ton of which makes the same or greater contribution to global warming over 100 years as 1 metric ton of CO2.
Well, that's a scientific question.
Yeah.
So it would have to be determined by the scientists at EPA.
Well, that's what
we
I'm
know that we know that other gases contribute to greenhouse emissions, just as we know about CO2. Methane, for example, is a contributor, and there are others. And so, identifying a greenhouse gas under this title, the Environmental Protection Agency is supposed to determine the science before they regulate.
Mr. Chairman, could we get an answer? I mean, I understand we don't have a trained climatologist on the staff that I'm aware of, but that is something I would like to see and see what that number is. Because everything in this act is based on, whether you regulate or not, is based on that standard.
Well, I think you can contact EPA. We certainly had hearings, and that could have been brought up at the hearings.
We've not had a hearing on this part of the bill.
Well, wait a
Chairman,
second.
as you very well know.
We didn't have a hearing on the allocations in Title IV, but we had our draft out in time.
This is Title III.
I know. We had a draft out that included Title III before the April recess. And after that, Mr. Markey held extensive hearings. He had hearings that I think went on a whole 4 or 5 days with hundreds of witnesses. The GWP values and the sources for the calculation are contained in the IPCC reports. That's the basis for it. We incorporate that in Title III. We leave it up to EPA to see whether and to measure whether a gas is a contributor to greenhouse consequences based on the science.
Before I ask the question of council, did you know that was in this bill?
You asking me?
Yes, sir.
Well, I certainly don't claim to know everything that's in this bill. I know that we left it to, we relied very heavily on the scientists, on the IPCC and others, and the consensus that they have that there is a problem of global warming. It's having an impact, and that we need to try to reduce it by the amounts that they think we need to achieve in order to avoid some of the consequences. That's what I know, but I don't know the details.
I'm asking a question.
I rely on the scientists.
I'm asking a question, Mr. Chairman, that I don't know the answer to, but that does appear to me to be a very, very low standard. Because what little I do know is that when you're generating billions of tons on an annual basis, and those billions of tons at most are going to have a very minor impact on temperature in the next 50 to 100 years, to have in the law a standard that you can regulate a greenhouse gas or a man-made gas based on 1 metric ton over 100 years, I believe is, I don't know this, but I think that's a very, very low threshold. And I would like, I mean, I'll be happy to write the letter myself to the EPA and find out what that is.
That's in there not as the threshold that for which regulation is required. It's in there as a threshold for determining whether a substance is a greenhouse gas. The thresholds are actually given later on. There has to be over 25,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions
And that's some of the
before they're
questions.
covered. And the chart on 712, the global or the carbon dioxide equivalents, are a way of comparing different gases.
Well, now that you brought that up, let me just, I'll ask.
Well, let me ask the gentleman that you're already over
Oh,
four.
I've had a lot of time, Mr. Chairman. If there's other people, I'm
Okay.
I'm not trying to be the only one.
Yes, well, Mr. Anybody on the Democratic side? Mr. Rogers, you seek recognition? Well, he'll have another chance. No, he'll have another chance.
Yeah, I don't want to be a microphone hog.
Dialogue, Mr. Chairman. I was a little concerned that the chairman said he didn't know everything that was in the bill when it's the single largest energy tax that we've ever applied to the United States of America. That scares me a little bit, not going to kid you. For council, if I could, on page 423, could you describe to me what an international offset credit is?
I'm sorry, sir, could you give me the line number? I'm not seeing
It is down in line 20 on page 423. I think I have the most updated.
Sorry, 433?
423, I'm sorry.
423, line 20?
International offset credits. It says a
Sir, are
covered
you working off the bill or the substitute?
Well, then you may have me there.
If it's the printed version, that would be the bill, not the substitute. That would be the bill.
While you're getting there, I'll read it. A covered entity may use one international offset credit in lieu of an emission allowance up to the amount permitted.
Yes.
And the president may apparently waive that to $2 billion specified in other paragraphs. So could you explain that to me?
I'm sorry, sir. I'm trying to get a copy of the bill as introduced.
Yeah, and I will apologize. I don't know what it is under the copy of which you're working under. Or I'd give you that one as well. Do you have one of these?
Which one?
I need to borrow that real quick. Would you like to borrow this one? Here you go.
We've got it. Thank you. International offset credits are credits that are issued pursuant to Section 743 of the Clean Air
I understand that, but for us laymen, what does that mean? What is an international credit? Is that a credit that's obtained by emissions?
that are reduced overseas for a project that is an overseas project that reduces emissions or that sequesters carbon.
So if I build a plant, if I'm, say, Nike, that has plants in Thailand or China or Bangladesh, as they do, supports this bill, and they build a plant there, and they can use credits for a plant that they build there. Is that correct? Help me understand that.
There are...
Is that what I'm just basically on an international credit. I use Nike as an example. We'll call it Company A.
There are detailed requirements under Section 743 that explain what is necessary for it to be an international offset credit.
Okay.
All of those requirements.
But let me just make sure I understand it now. That's why we're asking counsel. Is that if I'm a company, Company A, I build a facility outside of the continental United States, I can use any credit from that to apply back to the United States for my emissions? That's the way I read this?
No, it needs to meet specific requirements, and
Well, let me ask you, where would the international company be if it were not outside the United States, or international offset?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
I'm just trying to understand what an international offset is.
An international offset credit is a credit that companies in the United States can use in lieu of an emission allowance, to cover their greenhouse gas emissions. It is generated by an action that's taken outside the United States to reduce greenhouse gas emissions outside of the United States that can then be sold to the company inside the United States.
So could that include a company that is doing carbon sequestration overseas?
The generator of the offset credit is the
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to understand how this works. I mean, it's obviously fairly complicated, but how am I going to get a credit if I'm a company in Detroit, Michigan? How do I get that? How do I qualify for that? What does that mean? Does that mean
Without objection, the gentleman will be given 2 additional minutes.
Thank you.
Currently, there are U.S. companies that go out and develop what are called offset projects, where they undertake sequestration projects in other countries. These would apply only in developing countries. So in a developing country, they might go in and replant forests, for example, and generate emission carbon reductions.
All right. Can they make improvements to existing facilities overseas in a developing country?
That would be determined under the rules that EPA would set out.
So, but it's possible they could make the rule that if a company that has no carbon sequestration goes to that would qualify for an international credit, right? Because they've improved.
Potentially under, however, EPA would have to develop the rules first. There's an extensive set of criteria in the statute for what EPA would require in addition to an agreement with the developing country, between the U.S. and the developing country.
But as the bill stands today, there's nothing in this law that would prohibit that, is there?
No.
There's nothing in there to prohibit it. So, wow. So if General Motors, which now has been told by the administration, can import more cars from China in 2011, they could use this provision to make an improvement on a plant in China and then use the credit back here as well. Is that correct? If they meet the EPA rules, it's not prohibited. That would not be prohibited under this law. Is that correct? It's not prohibited.
There would have to be an international agreement between the U.S. and the host country first that would establish the criteria for judging whether an emissions reduction had occurred.
Really? Where is that in the bill? Where's that?
Yes. That is working off the
So if China would want to increase its production and I come up with this agreement, I could clearly set up a regime. All I have to do is have an agreement with the United States that meets certain criteria.
I'm sorry.
Wow. That's a little scary, Mr. Chairman. Did you know that it was in there?
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening. What is your concern?
Well, part of the agreement that is being proffered by the CAR committee in this administration is that we will import more cars starting in 2011 from China and South Korea. The international offset credit would allow them to, under some agreement that they could agree to, it's not prohibited under this, to actually make no improvements here, but increase their production overseas, send it back to the United States.
Well, gentlemen, yield to me. Are you speculating that it could happen?
It's not prohibited, yes.
Well, a lot of things are not prohibited.
Would you have believed that this administration would have pushed car companies to import more cars? And
No, I don't believe they have.
Absolutely they have, Mr. Chairman. I would encourage you to read the language. Matter of fact, the UAW believes it, too. The UAW is circulating a letter today. Are you disagreeing, Mr. Chairman, with the United Auto Workers?
It won't be the first time.
Well, that's an interesting position for you to be in, Mr. Chairman. They certainly believe it. And it's kind of funny. You probably, you and I don't agree.
Well, gentlemen, time has expired, but let me just indicate that you're very much more attuned to this than I would, but I have never heard from any source that this administration is trying to encourage the importation of cars from Asia at the expense of the cars that are produced here in the United States. As I understood, you asked counsel whether something could be done, and
I would be
And if
happy
it-
to work on an amendment together, Mr. Chairman, to prohibit that, including these international offsets overseas.
Well, I wouldn't want to support
And I'll get you
that.
the letter from the UAW today. I can get you a
I'd
copy.
be happy to see it, and
be
maybe
fantastic.
you may well convince me they took that position. But that doesn't mean it's going to convince me that that the Obama administration's taken that position. Maybe a preemptive letter by the UAW, or you can't convince me that I should react to something that hasn't happened.
Isn't our job
Gentleman's
to
time
prevent it
has
before
expired.
it happens, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Shouldn't we prevent it before it happens, though? I guess.
Well, let's see what you want to come up with, and I'll look at it.
So you'll work with me on some prohibitive.
Well, and I'll be happy to look and see what the letter you want to draft, and I'd like to get more information about it.
Yeah. And this is what worries me, Mr. Chairman, when we don't really know what's in the bill and what's at stake for
Well,
families that are
if
trying
I
to
can
earn
if
their
I can
living.
reclaim my time now, because I'm going to recognize myself. I don't want questions to be asked like, isn't it possible that something could happen, to which no lawyer would say it's not possible, and then if you can't say it's impossible, you jump to the conclusion it's going to happen. That just seems to me.
In fairness, Mr. Chairman,
No, I haven't
prohibit-
yielded. I haven't yielded to the gentleman. You've had your time. You haven't yielded, and that's what I fear may be happening, and suspect may be happening. But I'll be glad to look at it with the gentleman, because if there's a concern and there's an effort to try to head off an attempt by anybody in the Bush administration to take a strategy to bring in more foreign cars, if anything, this administration has been working with the auto industry to promote the sale of cars. The Sutton Amendment was supported by the Obama administration to get more cars purchased in the United States. The Obama administration has been working with the auto industry to try to figure out their viability for the future. And I wouldn't want people to start hearing things said at a hearing that is going to make them fear something that isn't happening. But if there's an attempt to prevent somebody from doing something at the administration by urging them not to do it, I'll be glad to look at it. I want to now recognize Mr. Barton for 5 minutes more. He had some questions, and then I'm going to recognize Ms. Escher to offer her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be very concise here. I want to first bring members' attention to page 422 on line 9. It says United States greenhouse gas emissions were other than 7.2 or 7,206 million metric tons. That's a requirement that the administrators, that's apparently the baseline of anthropogenic CO2 emissions in the United States in 2005. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, now my question to council, if that's what the baseline is, where do we get the 4,627 emission allowance baseline in 2012? Why is that number not identical to 7,206?
It reflects a number of things. One, there's a 3% reduction, the target that comes from Section 703.
Right.
And then second, this only applies to capped sectors or capped sources, and that is less than total U.S. greenhouse gas.
But what are the uncapped sources? Because it's about 2,600 minus 3% tons.
In 2012, the uncapped sectors would include, actually the statute goes through and lists the capped sectors or the capped sources, which would be easier. And in 2016, that is electricity generators, it is refiners and importers of fuel, and fluorinated gas manufacturers, and nitrogen trifluoride emitters.
So is it true that all of agriculture is exempt?
Agriculture is not listed as a covered entity.
So it's exempt.
Covered entities are defined in Section 713. on page 535. It's an electricity source, stationary source that produces for sale or distribution petroleum-based or coal-based liquid fuel, a stationary source that produces for sale in bulk fluorinated gases and other industrial gases, stationary sources that emit nitrogen trifluoride, a geologic sequestration site.
I understand. I've read the things that are covered. I just want to make sure that there are large sectors that are specifically exempt from this act.
Would you yield to me to ask a
Yeah,
question?
sure.
If an entity is not covered, does that mean it's exempt?
A covered entity would not have to comply with the requirements in Title. Something that is not a covered
uncovered
entity would not have to comply.
Okay.
But this act doesn't, to use the chairman's terminology, doesn't cover 2,600 man-made tons of CO2 in the United States.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you give me the?
Well, I'm just subtracting the first line, the first number on 2012, 4,627 from 7,206. And I agree that you've got to reduce that number by 3% because you want the chairman and the people that support the bill want reductions 3% below that the 2005 baseline.
There are covered entities that are covered under the under Title VII later that are not covered in 2012.
Well, I'm about out of time, so I would like some any entity that is covered that has an emission of 25,000 tons of CO2 a year. If it's listed as a covered entity and it's that much CO2, it has to comply. What is an example of 25,000 tons of CO2? What would does a truck stop emit 25,000 tons of CO2? Does
a truck stop would not be a covered entity under the definitions of covered entities.
Because it's not one of these specific listed.
It's only things that are specifically listed or that fall into those categories that are covered.
Okay. All right.
All others would be uncovered.
Correct.
Okay. My last, because I'm at the zero limit, on page 450, the Act sets up a strategic reserve.
Without objection, the gentleman would be given one additional minute.
It sets up a strategic reserve where depending on the year, a certain percentage of the allowances listed on page 420 is set aside to be auctioned off for those entities that need to purchase allowances. But it sets a minimum strategic auction price of $28 in 2009 dollars. And then it goes up 5% a year plus inflation, and then beginning in 2015, it's the price, the minimum price goes up to 60% above a rolling 36-month average. Now, $28 is a much higher number than $10 or $12 or $17. So my question, and this is really more to the chairman than to the council, is it not true that the minimum cost of this bill is going to be that $28 times the number of allowances that have to be auctioned, which even in year one is over 1,000 tons?
I don't think that's a correct assumption, because maybe council can go explain this further, but we don't look at it as just the allowances. There are a lot of other things in play, and a lot of the reductions will be achieved by other means than the allowances themselves. In fact, it would be in the interest of any covered entity to look for the least costly way to achieve the reductions required in that period of time and not have to use the allowances that they have at their disposal. Is that correct, Council?
Yeah, that's correct, sir. That there are sources will have some sources will have reductions they can make that will be cheaper than $28 a ton. some sources will either be given allowances or will have allowances that they can buy that should be, EPA modeling says would be less than $28 a ton. They can also buy international and domestic offsets and use those for compliance as well. And this is the strategic reserve is there more as a safety measure than as an expected.
Well, if the gentleman
cost.
would yield to me further, the compliance does not come only through the use of the allotments in the market. It can come from other ways of achieving the reductions. But as I also want to point out, in 2012, the cap is going to cover only the electricity sector, transportation, and the fuels and fluorinated gases. In 2014, industrial sources come in. In 2016, natural gas local distribution companies come in. So I think we have to recognize that there's a progression. By 2016, the draft covers 84.5% of U.S. emissions. So there's a phase-in of the covered entities and what goals will be achieved by them. The gentleman's time has expired, and the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bono, requested an opportunity to engage in some questions, and I wanted to recognize her before I call on Ms. Escher to offer her amendment.
I thank the chair and want to take this opportunity to thank council for your hard work and the chairman and ranking member for feeding us for a couple of days. So question for council is the RES in this legislation takes a step in the right direction, in my opinion,
This is minimum.
to include waste-to-energy facilities, but they're qualified in the bill. Now, I've toured a facility in my district, and I'm very excited about the potential this technology has to remove matter from our landfills to produce clean energy. So I just wanted to ask council a few questions on portions of how this energy source is qualified. On page 15, line 14, begins the definition of qualified waste to energy. Included in that definition are the following requirements. It says, such terms shall include only the energy derived from the non-fossil biogenic portion of such waste or debris. But can you explain why we only count the biogenic portion of the waste from waste to energy?
Is your question about the intent?
It's the question is just seems to it doesn't make sense why you're incentivizing landfill gas is at a full credit, but waste to energy gets a partial credit, and it is 10 times more efficient than landfill gas. But we're definitely picking and choosing winners here, and I'm wondering why you're qualifying it and then just counting the biogenic portion of what is actually generated. Why you're separating out the electricity that is created from one of these facilities.
I can't speak to the rationale behind that.
All right. Then looking at section C1 on the next page, moving on from that, but still concerning waste to energy facilities. If the concern is that these facilities will go online without the necessary permitting and be either dangerous or in some way negatively impact the environment, why wouldn't we extend these requirements to all sources of renewable energy? Are we less concerned about wind or geothermal plants having the legally required permits? Why are we treating waste to energy differently than other sources?
Gentlelady, yield to me.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
The renewable portion of the municipal solid waste is the biogenic portion. And what is this word here? Paper, food waste, and cold board, et cetera. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about the renewable portion of the solid waste. I hope that helps.
It helps, Mr. Chairman, but it's just sort of common sense that if you put it in a landfill, it is going to create gas, and you're going to use that gas, but you're going to, it is what 1/10 as efficient as if you burn it and put it towards the waste to energy credits. It doesn't make sense that you are picking and choosing on where you're going to dispose of that product and actually do it in a much less efficient manner. Would you?
If you yield to me, the part that the biogenic part is the part that becomes the gas. The rest of it is a solid waste and would not produce the gas.
All right. Well, when I toured this, I was just sort of a little bit stymied by some of the environmental positions that it is bad and less than favorable. And first of all, I appreciate your including it in the bill. But these facilities are very complex projects with enormous, sophisticated equipment. How would a facility be treated in cases where malfunctions or equipment failures caused a facility to be temporarily non-compliant?
Council, answer that question.
Council, Chairman, anybody?
This section would be implemented by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they would interpret the language here in their implementation.
Do you believe that that would have some sort of impact on the facility's annual certification?
Gentlelady, yield to me.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
You're raising some serious questions that I'd like to review with you to see if we're doing exactly what we ought to be doing in this regard. And so if you would permit, why don't we set aside these questions and go over it in more detail, because maybe we should look for some further refinement of the language.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Again, I just want to thank you for including it in the bill to begin with, and appreciate the time. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Esche was ready to go, but Mr. Pitt wants to ask some questions.
Just in follow-up.
Let me ask you, Ms. Esche, because we really should go back and forth. Mr. Barton made quite a point of that on our first day of the markup, that we need to go by tradition back and forth for recognition. Would it be acceptable to you if Mr. Pitt asked his questions? Okay, Mr. Pitt, I'd like to yield to you 5 minutes. Mr. Pitt, I don't know if you realize I called on you. You're recognized for 5 minutes to pursue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to follow up on the line of questioning, if you could clarify. I have.
Hold on a second. Let me set the timer again so you could.
Yes, sir.
For 5 minutes. I thought you were about to ask questions, and I want you to be able to have the full opportunity. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could continue on the line of questioning. I have a waste-to-steam energy plant in my district, and I visited. It's municipal waste. They take out the metal and the plastic and burn the rest. Now, under this bill, would that be considered a renewable energy source? Because they otherwise would landfill it, and it would produce a lot of methane.
Yes.
The logic that Ms. Bonomack was making. So under this bill, you said the biogenic portion would be renewable. Well, it's mixed municipal waste. Would that be a renewable resource?
Can council respond to that question? I think it's a good one.
It sounds like in this case, the plastics and the metals, the non-biogenic materials removed. If what's left is the biogenic material,
well, everything except plastic and metal is left. Now, is that biogenic? Is that renewable?
I can't speak to the specific facility, but the biogenic portion under the legislation would produce.
And how do you determine the biogenic portion of municipal waste?
Could you repeat that question?
How do you determine the biogenic portion of municipal waste?
This definition and the overall section would be implemented by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They would have to look at this definition and implement it.
The question I have is, do waste-to-steam energy plants, which are quite efficient, and I've visited, and it's quite clean. You can look at the stack and not even see anything being emitted. It does seem to be a renewable resource, should be considered renewable, and that is the question, Mr. Chairman, that I'm asking.
Well, the renewable is the biogenic portion. That comes from the paper, the food waste, the cold board, things like that. But the rest of it is not going to be
Well, it burns, so I don't know if it's
really
biogenic or not, but it
Okay.
produces
Well,
a lot of electricity in our area, and it's clean waste. You know, when it's done, there's a little bit of ash left that is put over the landfill as a cap.
Well, let's take a further look at that. I think
Thank
that
you.
was the point.
Mr. Chairman, if I could
Bono Mac-
continue, I have
Right.
just a couple
Yes.
of minutes. We were talking earlier about international offset credits and the International Climate Change Adaptation Program. And, you know, that sounds a little bit to me like the Global Fund that we voted on last week. And I'm wondering, who would administer this program? And are there any oversight protections? Because there's not a lot of oversight on the Global Fund.
I'm sorry.
Gentlemen, yield to me. It would be administered by EPA. There would be oversight within EPA and by the Congress. Maybe Council wants to give any further explanation than that, but that's my understanding. They have to determine whether the offset is a genuine offset and whether it would be considered as an offset for the purposes of this act.
The rules for
Is your mic on?
the rules setting up the criteria for offsets would be established by EPA. EPA would have to require for each project third-party verification. They would have to require that the emissions removal, reduction, or sequestration had already occurred prior to the granting of the offset credit, and there are provisions for audits on a periodic basis.
And who would oversee or administer the International Climate Change Adaptation Program? That's in Title IV. Is there any oversight from an international body is another question.
Yes, as I understand it, it would be the State Department and the USAID, our government agencies.
And are there protections to ensure against waste, fraud, and abuse is a question I would have.
Well, that's the job of the people within the administration to watch out for that, and it's the job of Congress to pursue it through oversight.
Yeah, I think.
Section 494, subsection C, provides for oversight and designates the secretary.
What page is that?
Sorry, it's page 937 of the substitute. The Secretary of State or such other federal agency head as the President may designate, in consultation with the Administrator of USAID, shall oversee the distribution of allowances available to carry out the program to a multilateral fund or international institution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Pitt. Ms. Eshoo, I don't know what to do. Mr. Barton said he didn't think he could support your amendment. That would mean, after debate, we'd go to a vote on your amendment. But we're waiting for members to return. We indicated there would be no votes before 8:30, but that's only 7 minutes away. There are people at the White House who want to be here, and we want to have here on both sides of the aisle to respond to any vote, because to be fair, and so we are waiting for them to return. But I think that we ought to have a Republican amendment to Title III, and I was informed that Mr. Murphy has an amendment to Title III that would engender a great deal of debate. I don't know if yours would engender that much debate. It seems to me your amendment is a pretty straightforward one, and I don't know why it wouldn't be accepted just on a voice vote. But on the other hand, the rules that the Republican leader on the committee have set for us is that if there's an amendment that they don't find acceptable, they want to have a roll call vote. And we're not ready to go to a roll call vote. So what I'm saying is that I wish Mr. Murphy would arrive, and he is on his way. So let's sit tight for a minute. And the gentleman has some questions he wishes to ask? Well, then why don't I recognize you for 5 minutes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Council, and again, I just want to try to understand. This is, again, the bill form on page 437, line 8, entitled the minimum strategic reserve auction price in subsequent years. First of all, could you describe what the minimum strategic reserve auction price, the strategic reserve auction is?
The bill would set aside a number of allowances in the strategic reserve. It specifies the percentage that will be drawn, the number and the percentage that will be put into the strategic reserve. And then quarterly, there is an auction of a specified number of allowances from the reserve.
And what might an allowance be, or what might go into the strategic reserve? What is it? Is it a metric ton of something? Is it a? It's some quantity of some.
It's allowances that go into the reserve.
And who establishes what that allowance is?
Section 720. Section 721 establishes what the allowances are.
Okay, and those allowances are things that have been established by the government as some entity that would qualify for an allowance. Is that correct, under the law?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you were saying.
That the panel, the government, decides what quantity or what would qualify as a quantity to relate to an allowance that could be put into the reserve. So it establishes what that quantity of whatever it is.
An allowance is the authorization to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent.
That was the point where I was getting to. Good. And in this particular case, it says the auction price shall be 60% above a rolling 36-month average. Help me understand what that means.
That means the administrator would look at what the average price of allowances had been over the 3-year period or 36-month period leading up to the auction, and then the average of that price would be the minimum floor price or the reserve price for the auction.
Plus 60%.
Plus 60%, yes.
And why 60%? I don't understand that.
The statute sets 60% above the average price as the floor price for the reserve.
And the average price would be determined by the auction, or is it determined by trading of that particular?
It's the 36-month average of the daily closing price for that year's emission allowance vintage as reported on registered carbon trading facilities,
right, so,
calculated using constant
So this
dollars.
is now a commodity trade. So Wall Street is trading the value of this metric ton. Is that correct? That's how that would work?
Allowances may be traded.
Okay, so so some financial market, I'll say Wall Street, trades this metric ton, and over 36 months they affix a value to that by average. So every day, one day it's $100, next day it's $90, right? And it's right. And after that's over, then they say we're going to put more into the market, but they have to be sold for 60%. So who buys them at that 60% rate?
The strategic reserve auctions can only be accessed by covered entities.
So a company who, say, is for whatever reason needs to buy these credits, means they could grow. They hired 100 new employees. They're growing. They're outside their emissions. They have to go to the strategic reserve.
No, they have other places that they can go. They can. Some of them may be given allowances for free under Section 782.
No, I understand, but so
some
who would
credits.
buy these 60%? That's what I don't understand.
The gentleman yield to me.
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is a safety valve in the market, because if the value of an allowance went too high, there could be a increase in the supply by the release of the allowances that are the offsets that would then be made available. This is an interesting and I thought quite innovative approach. As you may know, the U.S. Climate Action Partnership worked for over 2.5 years in developing the idea of how this would work. These are the people who have to live with it. And they wanted to be sure that they weren't put in a situation where there could be any manipulation of the market, since they're the ones who have to buy the allotments. So they established a mechanism for an increase of supply when the demand is high enough so that otherwise it would drive up the price. Now, in addition to that, we adopted and put into the base bill language offered by Mr. Bart Stupak, our colleague, who's done a great deal of work on market manipulation. And he put in provisions, recommended that we put in provisions that have even stronger enforcement powers to make sure that there's no manipulation in the market. But your question was why the extra offsets would be added to the allowances, and that is a way to hold down the costs. The whole system is to provide a mechanism for achieving the reductions in carbon emissions at the lowest possible price, and to avoid any manipulation of the market. The structure was calibrated to provide an equilibrium. So when you talk about a 30-month average of the price over a period of time, you're not dealing with any aberration, you're balancing it out. But then if it indicates a trend, the demand could be met with a greater supply.
And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. Maybe you can help me further understand. It says a minimum strategic reserve auction price. So if you're that person who has to buy in that particular year, you've lost all the advantage of the market that you say has, and now I pay 60% higher than the market says is that particular commodity is. Oh, it's right here.
The gentleman's time has expired, but I do think that there are protections that are written in so that people can be there's a banking system where they can use allotments that they've saved for this kind of purpose. You know, you get an allotment, you don't use it unless you have to. And you don't have to use it because there are other ways of achieving the reductions that are going to be more cost effective.
Unintended consequences may be this punishes those companies who are growing and now have to pay a higher price for the same commodity over the 36-month average.
I beg to
it says right here on page 437.
It says that it punishes companies?
Absolutely. The minimum strategic reserve auction price shall be 60% above a rolling 36-month average.
Yes.
They've lost all the benefit of the 3-year.
No, I disagree with you. I don't think that's what it means at all. But you've exceeded the time by almost 2.5 minutes, and Mr. Murphy has arrived, so I want to recognize him at this point to be able to offer his amendment. We can get into amendments and get moving on this markup process so that we can consider different alternatives. But thank you for your questions. I think they were very provocative.